Hello. Security abroad, security at home. President Trump has transformed the world order. Now, the Prime Minister says things have got to change here too. His enforcer, Cabinet Minister Pat McFadden, is here with plans to cut back the civil service. And Philp wants new rules on immigration. He's here for the Tories too. Change in America means fear in Ukraine. We'll hear from Kyiv this morning.
So that's the biggest fear, that actually Ukraine will not exist anymore and Kyiv will be destroyed, or here will be, instead of Ukrainian flags, there will be Russian flags.
And Nigel Farage's Reform UK explodes into rows. We'll ask the deputy leader what on earth's going on.
It's very sad, it's unfortunate, but we had to be decisive. It was the responsible thing to do.
Morning to you, and a warm welcome to our team at the desk for the next hour. Historian Dan Snow, former Defence Secretary and Cabinet Minister Penny Mordaunt, and the pollster from research group More in Common, Luke Trill. Welcome to you all. Let's start, as we always do, with what's in the news today, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. The Sunday Times splashes with activists targeting British defence companies and a picture of the aftermath of what they describe as Ukraine's fresh agony after more Russian attacks. It's COVID Reflection Day today, and The Observer marks that by reporting that the United Kingdom was one of the hardest hit countries. The Sunday Mirror highlights the Home Secretary's plans to crack down on what they call yobs in our town centres. And the Mail on Sunday has the story of a man who's just crossed the channel in a small boat, who they say is a militant who's called for Jewish people to be killed. Well, welcome to all three of you. We are going to start by focusing really on what's still going on in Ukraine and the changes we've seen this week with America cutting off some intelligence sharing. Dan, from a historical point of view, what kind of shift are we seeing?
It's a diplomatic revolution. It's unsettling and it's scary because we had a sort of stasis. We had a situation, a global situation that we thought was, well, I think we thought it was natural. We thought it was immutable. But we should not have thought that, because history tells us that the present is never inevitable. It's never immutable. These things always change. There have been revolutions in the past. There's the diplomatic revolution in the 18th century. There was Hitler and Stalin's alliance in 1939, unimaginable. And so we need to accept the fact that we're just going to live in a different world now.
Penny, you've got lots of contacts in Washington with different American politicians. Dan says it's a revolution, but what are you hearing from Capitol Hill?
Well, look, I think it's worth just reminding everyone that this is the same Russian army that has raped and murdered civilians, that has kidnapped thousands of children, tortured Christian priests, prisoners of war. The idea that all you have to do to end this war is for Ukraine to lay down their arms is ridiculous. This was always Putin's war to end. It still is. And that's where people want to see the pressure applied. There's no evidence to date that the President of the United States has managed to get anything from Russia. And so I think there is growing disquiet, even amongst those who are very loyal to the President, who went out and supported him after that incident in the Oval Office, for example. They're concerned about the stopping of assistance to Ukraine, and they're concerned about them stepping down offensive cyber against Russia.
And Luke, when you look then at public opinion, which is part of this public opinion in the States, public opinion across Europe, public opinion here, where there's for a long time been a real sense of sympathy in the UK for Ukrainians themselves, what are you looking at?
Well, the really interesting thing is that Starmer seems to have completely met the public mood when it comes to his response to Ukraine. So we have some new research out today which finds that 80% of Brits think that it's important to the UK that Ukraine defends its sovereignty. What we don't have in the UK is that polarisation on Ukraine that you see in the US and in parts of the continent. But I think more than that for Starmer, I think why this has been important is that Starmer's slightly, I think I can call it slightly stolid approach, has sometimes rubbed up against the public's impatience for change to fix the country. But on this, it's allowing him to play that kind of reassurer role. You know, people in focus groups this week have been saying, you know, I like the fact he's acting as that bridge between the US and Europe, and genuinely seems to have a relationship with Trump where he can perhaps, and you know, you never know with Trump, calm down some of his excesses.
Well, that's really interesting. And there's certainly a sense when you talk to people in and around Keir Starmer that this has been a good political moment for him, even though it's such a serious crisis. We'll be back with you a bit later in the show. And the conversation about what next for Ukraine has, of course, been dominated by those big political characters and their clashes: Trump, Zelensky, Putin. But we wanted to hear this morning from some of those whose lives have been upended since the invasion in Ukraine. Here are 3 stories from Kyiv of the last 3 years.
Hi, I'm Roman Zinchenko.
My name is Darina.
Hi, my name is Tanya.
I couldn't believe I still really remember the day when I woke up and I just entered Facebook and I see everyone post that the war started. And yeah, it was hard.
The biggest actually loss was the loss of one of the closest friends who volunteered to defend Ukraine and who lost his life near Bakhmut. Alexei Khabatyuk was our mentor, friend. So among all the wartime losses, he was probably one of the biggest losses.
My main fear is that our European partners will betray us. So it's my main fear, and of course, it's to be a part of Russia. It's my biggest fear nowadays.
So yeah, the life changed dramatically. It seems that life is normal, just our monument is covered, but probably the main fear is that Russian army will come here to Kyiv. That's the biggest fear, that actually Ukraine will not exist anymore and Kyiv will be destroyed, or here will be, instead of Ukrainian flags, there will be Russian flags.
Well, Pat McFadden's formal title is the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, so a bit of a mouthful, but your informal title as a Prime Minister's right-hand man. Welcome to you this morning. Last week, the Prime Minister sat in the chair and said that he was seeking a coalition of the willing to guard a potential peace in Ukraine. How many countries have so far told you they're up for that and they would take part?
Well, these discussions are going on. I think it's important to have European countries involved in this. The phrase "step up" has been used quite a lot in recent weeks. The UK is stepping up. The Prime Minister certainly stepped up, and other countries have indicated that they want to do that. Of course, coalition of the willing means people have to be up for it. They have to step forward themselves. They can't be dragooned by us. But the UK and the Prime Minister is playing an important role in those discussions and will continue to do that.
But can you give us a sense of the scale of that willingness? Because to have a coalition of the willing, it's important to know if people actually are willing. There's been suggestions that there might have been as many as 20 countries who've indicated that they might be up for it. Is that roughly in the zone of what you might be hoping for?
I think when you use the word scale, it's a good way to use it, because what I think people are coming to terms with is the scale of change in European security in recent weeks. Donald Trump's not the first American president to say that Europe had to step up and do more for its own security, but the pace and scale of that calling, if you like, has definitely changed in the last month. And what's important when the world is changing as fast as it is right now is that we understand the change, we respond to it, and we explain it to the public, and that's exactly what the Prime Minister's been doing.
But it's also important for people to know what that response might look like. Are you realistically looking at the UK and France, maybe going it alone? We've heard from the Foreign Minister of Norway. We'll hear this interview later in the programme. He didn't seem committing. He said that his country doesn't sort of know enough about what you're really talking about. So are you really hopeful that you're going to get something like 20 countries being part of this? Or might this just be the UK and France?
Well, I don't think the measure of success is adding up just the number of countries, and it's fair enough for other Prime Ministers to say, I want to know more. But what's important is this, what's really important is this, is that we get a stop to the fighting which is a secure and lasting peace.
And that's
what
why
all of
Keir
this is about.
Starmer wants a coalition of the
That's
willing.
what
But I
all of
think
this
people
is
want to
about.
know, are we talking about something here that might be UK troops for some years potentially, and French troops potentially for some years, being in Ukraine, guarding a potential peace for that security that you've just mentioned? Or are you genuinely in government hopeful that this might be a big, grand international coalition with many countries involved?
Well, we want European countries to step up. Obviously, it's their decision. They're sovereign countries. They make their own decision. But I think it's really important to remember what all of this is aimed at. The fear in Ukraine and the concern of the Prime Minister himself is that we don't just get a cessation to current fighting, but that's not backed by anything. And we had that before with the Minsk agreement that didn't hold. And what you don't want is a stop to the fighting, which only lasts as long as President Putin wants it to. And that is why there is this talk of security guarantees. That's why there is this conversation with European leaders. And that's why there's also a discussion with the United States about how to make sure we get a lasting peace and not just a ceasefire.
But you don't yet have that security guarantee from America that Keir Starmer went to the White House to try to get. And in the last few days, the US has stopped sharing intelligence with Ukraine. They've stopped sharing satellite imagery with Ukraine. There's been a fresh wave of strikes from the Russians, missiles falling from the sky. We've seen in the last few days, America has not been behaving as a reliable ally for Ukraine. Do you deny that?
Well, that's their decision. We have made clear our position on Ukraine is we will continue to supply Ukraine with weapons,
but the
with
question here
intelligence
is about
support,
trust, because Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, told us last week, in his view, America was a reliable ally. Can you say, in the last few days, America has been behaving as a reliable ally of Ukraine?
Their decisions on Ukraine are for them. We do believe America is a reliable ally.
For Ukraine?
We
they've cut them off?
We talk to them constantly. In terms of the British position on Ukraine, we will still continue to support them with weapons, with intelligence, with help on the cyber front. We believe that the Ukrainian people and armed forces, as the clips you just played showed, are engaged in an existential an existential struggle rather for their country, for their freedom to decide their own future, and we want the security side of this to enable them to make those decisions, not just to have a pause in fighting while President Putin can kind of regroup, rearm and decide what he wants to do next.
And I know you, as all ministers here, are very careful not to say anything that might be perceived in the White House as being critical of the president, and there are obvious diplomatic reasons for that. But this week, Donald Trump sent the stock market haywire by doing a sort of hokey-cokey with tariffs, big tariffs against Mexico and Canada that were going to be on, then they were off. There were the decisions that have affected Ukraine so profoundly. What's it like dealing with that kind of zigzagging, that constant change?
Well, I think one of the lessons from it is probably not to react immediately to everything that's said. It's tempting in interviews like this for someone in your position to say, what's your latest response to the latest comment overnight? British ministers have adopted a stance of not reacting to everything that's said overnight. I think that's been the right thing to do.
What's it like dealing with that zigzagging? I mean, you're being very, very open, actually, about how you are keeping your mouths shut deliberately.
Well, what we're focusing on is what happens, and it's what happens that matters. That's true of Ukraine, and it's true of the economic issues that you're talking about. We're focused on what happens, and what will guide us all the way through is acting in the British national interest. And remember, this is an important thing to stress. It is in the British national interest to maintain a strong alliance with the United States. It's long, it's deep, it's based on many, many things. It's been there for many years. We want to maintain that, and that guides what we do.
But Dan Snow's just told us we're living through a political revolution, essentially, and everything happening internationally, of course, has profound effects here too. You've already cut back aid for some of the most vulnerable people in the world in order to choose to spend more on defence. And this week we're going to hear, I think, a lot from ministers about changes you want to make in this country, starting today with changes you want to make to shake up the civil service and how Whitehall works. Obviously, there's concern that means people losing their jobs. How many people do you think will lose their jobs? And are you doing this to save money or because you want it to work differently?
We're doing it because we need to reform the state. It is really important. The state has grown a lot in recent years. There's an extra 130,000 civil servants being hired in the last few years of the Conservative government. There are some reasons for that. Brexit and COVID. We were, of course, promised Brexit would lead to less bureaucracy, but following it, a huge number of extra civil servants were hired.
Well, we can have a look at those numbers so we can see it in context if we can just bring up the graph of how things changed over time. So you can see back when you were a political operator in Downing Street back under Tony Blair, so just over 450,000. Then it crashed during the austerity years under the coalition. And then, as you say, it's gone up and up and up. So where, broadly, do you think it should be?
Well, I think the old tactic of picking a headcount number for reduction hasn't worked. That's what Boris Johnson did. He's up there on the screen. They said they would cut it by 90,000. After that, hiring went up. And I actually don't think this should be the guiding principle. The guiding principle should be, how can the state change? We're on the threshold of an enormous technological revolution right now. I've seen really exciting applications of AI in public services in recent months. For example, AI teaching assistants in classroom, AI used for breast cancer screening to help radiologists screen better and more accurately. But we should be really excited about these innovations.
But forgive me, you are spelling out this week how you want to change the civil service. And as I understand it, the option is to slim it down. And I know you're not going to give us numbers, but for some kind of context, does the civil service, it doesn't need to be as big as it is now? Ought it to be more like it was back in the last time?
I'm going to resist headcount numbers because I think it narrows the discussion too much. I think the central civil service would and can become smaller, but I want to see more civil servants working outside London, where I think the state can get better value for money. For example, my own department, the Cabinet Office, has got a second headquarters in Glasgow. Fantastic team of people working there. I visited them twice. We want to see more of that around the country. We also want to see more data and digitally skilled people in the civil service. Not enough at the moment. I'd like to double that proportion by the end of the decade. And I want to see more of these technological applications in the front line.
But how radical are you really willing to be? I mean, everybody will have seen Elon Musk parading around on stage with a chainsaw. You know, Pat McFadden, I don't think is going to turn into Elon Musk anytime soon. But are you actually willing to be very, very radical when it comes to this? Because, forgive me, I've heard a lot of government ministers over more years than I care to remember say, oh, we must get the civil service to work better. Oh, it could probably be done better if we used more technology and we had people doing things more effectively. So how radical are you really willing to be? Because I know you're going to make it easier to sack people.
Yeah, well, look, performance management is part of every big organisation, but there's an important thing for you and your viewers to remember. We're a centre-left government. We believe in good public provision. That's why we fought the election, saying we wanted to have more teachers in schools, more neighbourhood police officers, why we wanted to get waiting lists down. It is part of what we believe in, that the state can provide both security and opportunity for people. That will guide us in our actions. It's upfront in our policies. So we will be radical about this, but it's about getting bang for our buck in terms of the outcomes for the public. It isn't an ideological approach to stripping back the state.
But one of the weird things about this is you talk about having the civil service being slimmed down, even though you won't put a number on it. But actually, since Labour's been in office, you've been busy setting up all sorts of new arm's length bodies, to use the fancy terms. Quangos, look there, we've got GB Energy, Skills England, the National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority. I think there's more than 20 of them. So how does that add up? You're creating all these new public organisations, which of course all have staff and all use taxpayers' money, and then you're saying you want to slim things down. Look, the list's still going.
Because we do believe in the power of government to do good. But when the world is changing so fast in the private sphere, think of the way that you buy things, think of the way that you transact with organisations, think of the way that you find out information. We've got a duty
to set up new quangos.
That applies in the state world as well as the private sphere. And that's what we want to do. I think this can be an exciting time to be a civil servant. I think we can break down some of the barriers that have seen this rarefied policy world separated from the front line. We want to bring those together more. I think it can be really rewarding. It's quite interesting in the staff surveys. This is what they want as well. when we survey the staff, what do you want? They want better performance management. They want to be able to take more risks. They want fewer layers of checking. I'm with them on that. I get to work with brilliant civil servants every day. I want to see them achieve their full potential so that we can get the best outcomes for the public.
And do you want more of them to go back to work? If you want to take lessons from the private sector, lots of companies are now saying, all back to the office.
Well, look, I think we're a bit flexible about this, but if you ask me my own instincts, there is value to being in the office, value from learning from your colleagues, and I think we lose something if we have too little of that. So yes, I think being in the office, generally speaking, is a good thing.
There are a couple of things I just want to briefly raise. We're also going to hear this week about how you want to cut the ballooning welfare bill. And I know before you say you're going to have to wait to hear the details, I want to ask you a couple of things on principle. Is it fair that you can get as much as an extra £400 a month in benefits if you're sick rather than somebody who's out of work looking for a job? Is that fair?
What's not fair is for millions of people to be left on long-term sickness benefits with no prospect of work, which is not good for them and it's not good for the taxpayer.
Is it fair for the taxpayer that some people can get more money if they're on the sick rather than looking for a job?
Well, look, the benefit system recognises that for some conditions people will need extra income, but we are going to bring forward welfare reform plans.
And are you going to make changes to disability benefit?
They will be part of this discussion. Yes, they will, because I think it's really important your readers understand this right now, or your viewers rather.
And readers and listeners, all sorts these days.
There are 2.8 million people on long-term sickness benefits. We are an outlier in the UK, and not in a good way. We're the only G7 country that hasn't recovered its pre-pandemic rate of employment. And we're the Labour Party. We believe in work. We believe in the good that a good job can do for people. We don't believe it is good that if somebody could work with a bit of support, that they're left to live a life on benefits. 200,000 of those 2.8 million have told us they would work tomorrow with the right support. So we've got to reform the system, because if we don't, the trajectory of standing back and doing nothing is that it won't be 2.8 million in a few years, it'll be over 4 million people.
And it'll be interesting to hear more from Liz Kendall, the Welfare Secretary, on that later this week. And just briefly, the Conservatives today are saying, we'll hear more about it later, that the Human Rights Act shouldn't apply to immigration cases. That would be a way of cracking part of the immigration problem. Are you interested in that idea?
Well, two quick responses to it. First, they had 14 years to do something about this and didn't. Secondly, it looks like an outsourcing plan, so that instead of these cases appealing to British courts, they would all appeal to the court in Strasbourg. I don't think that really deals with the issue, and I'm afraid it's symptomatic of the kind of gimmicks without action that we saw for the long, long period of
power. So
you'll
vote against it? They're going to try and force a vote in Parliament?
We won't adopt that amendment, because what's the point of just outsourcing all our immigration decisions to Strasbourg?
OK, well, we'll talk to Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, more about that later in the programme. But Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, to give you your proper title without garbling it, thank you very much indeed for coming to the studio this morning. Well, as ever, let us know what you think. Email us, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or you can WhatsApp or use social media or whatever you fancy on this Sunday morning, because I know a lot of you will be watching with your phones as well as on the telly. Let's then get to our panel. In terms of how the government has been handling this situation, Penny, you spent a long time as a Conservative minister, but how do you think Labour have been handling the international whirlwind at the moment?
Look, I think on the talking softly front, they've been doing very well. I think we've seen British diplomacy at its finest. Where we're not doing so well is on carrying the big stick. There have been some announcements on defence spending. It's nowhere near enough. And if we're going to find the money we are going to need for future years to deter Russian aggression, which is at least another 20 billion a year, government hasn't just got to cut civil service count, it's got to look at what it's fundamentally doing. We've got to do less better as a country. And the key to cutting civil servants is look at what you're doing as a government and cut that. Do the things that only government can do.
But look, do you think the public is really up for a really tough conversation saying, yeah, look, this is a time of huge insecurity. We've got to find loads more money to keep people safe, but that will mean losing perhaps some of the things you rely on. The public receptive?
Yeah, well, first, I mean, there's very definitely a recognition that the world has changed and that we need to change. I think one of the most striking of our recent findings was that less than half the public now consider the US to be an ally.
Less than half?
Less than half would say the US is an ally, and that right across Europe there is a sense that, Russia isn't going to stop at Ukraine. That comes through very clearly in the polling. So there's that recognition we need to do more. The support, certainly, for investment in defence. But that comes off the back of the public basically thinking, we've been told since the financial crash 16, 17 years ago that we've got to make tough decisions. When are we going to get to the good stuff? So I think the government's got a real balancing act of, yes, the public recognise, things have changed, we have to change, but how do you do it in a way in which people don't think, God, this is just another slog? Dan, what do you make of how the government has been handling it?
Well, I think Penny's right. The talking has gone well, and Luke's right as well. That was the cometh the hour. I mean, if you're worried about the rules-based international order, well, it turns out getting a sort of rather internationalist lawyer in charge of your country is that he was the right man for that job. He's been sober. He's said the right thing. He's been strong about Ukraine, and poor things. He and Pat trying to sort of tie themselves into knots, not annoying the Trump administration whilst also trying to forge this coalition of the willing. And I'm very glad I'm not a diplomat or politician at the moment. But
still time, Dan. Still time.
And so, but the key thing is what next? The key thing is, well, what happens when the French go, okay, fine, to be part of this big new European procurement process, we're going to need you to do some things. We're going to need you to build closer links with the EU and whatever it might be. Well, then that's decision time. That's going to be, what do we do about whether we're buying from America or buying from German and European companies? And that is just difficult, and it's in the weeds, but that's the real work of deterrence.
So this has been the easy part, do you think, so far?
This is the easy part. This is the Churchill saying, we'll fight them on the beaches. That's great. And the next bit is actually, well, how do you deter Vladimir Putin? And realistically, where's the line? Like, where is the line? Is it the Baltics? What in 1938 and 39, Britain faced a series of decisions about exactly what the red line was. And of course, all of these things are about judgment. Hitler thought that Britain wouldn't go to war for Poland. We collectively, at some stage, we're going to have to say to Vladimir Putin, fine, Ukraine maybe the line is in Ukraine. Maybe the line is including all of 1994 Ukraine or whatever it is. But it may be that the line becomes Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. And at that stage, he has to sell that to our European partners, and then we have to mean it. And that's the real decision. That's big time.
OK, we'll come back to you three in a second, but you referenced there some of Russia's other neighbours. And yesterday we had a conversation with Norway. Of course, they've got different geographical interests across Europe. Political leaders have all been trying to figure out what it means for them, what Trump's attitude means for the NATO alliance that for decades has been in place to keep people safe, and what does it mean for their own security and their own defence spending. Well, last week, Norway announced it was doubling aid to Ukraine. We spoke to its foreign minister, Espen Barth Edie, about how Norwegians are feeling right now.
People used to feel that, we had many day-to-day challenges in our life in most countries, that we were fundamentally safe from existential threats. I think there is an increased understanding that cannot be taken for granted, that has to be invested in, and that we are much stronger together than each on our own. This is not really the time to say me first, but rather to say what can we do together to come out stronger together.
You say it's not the time to say me first, but Donald Trump says America first. And he says that almost more than he says anything else. Is that the problem?
Well, what's important for us is that does not mean America alone. I mean, it's not unique to have a primary responsibility for your own country. But I think most of us believe that our country is better off when we work together, when we solve problems. And of course, we have now almost 80 years ago, a system of norms and rules were set up with the UN Charter and all the multilateral institutions, and then a few years later NATO and the World Trade Organizations, and all these bodies have ensured that there were some rules of the game. Some of them were universal, some were more Western, but we've been living good lives, and we have been able to progress economically in that system. And when big questions are asked about the future of that system. We need to think about it, reflect on it, see if we can reform and improve it, but also fundamentally to keep it alive.
What do you do, though, when the most powerful man in the Western world doesn't care very much for those rules?
Well, I think the first plan would be to work with him and the people around him and convince him that these rules are actually good also for him. I think the discussions we're having right now among Western allies and others about potential trade war. I think when you look into it, if we all raise tariffs against each other, we will all get poorer. The economic growth in every country will be reduced. It's also important because some of the countries who are now spending a lot of energy on trying to avoid a trade war are exactly the countries that should collaborate in security terms in order to save Ukraine, make sure that we have a peaceful future and that we are not rewarding people who replace norms with use of violence, as Putin's Russia has done.
But with all your years of experience, can you believe that questions are being asked about whether America would stand by other Western democracies, whether they'd actually favour a resurgent Russia that's very much not a democracy? Can you really believe this moment's unfolding?
Well, frankly, we haven't seen exactly this before. There's been ups and downs in the transatlantic relationship before. There have been times disagreements. Remember the Iraq War, for instance. But we were still, living in an assumption that the fundamentals were certain, that we were not questioning whether we were allies. I think we are. So I'm not questioning that, but I do realize that there is that questions are asked, and some of them for good reasons, about the future of all this. And I think that the best response is not to panic, but to rather invest in strengthening what we have. Because if it's questioned, we should have good answers, and if it needs reform, we should reform.
You don't want to panic, but do you worry?
It is the most dramatic security situation of the last 80 years. And that makes me, of course, worried. But out of that worry, I become more determined to use my own and our resources to try to deal with these questions. And I'm very glad to see that so many of our friends and allies are taking the same position, that rather than panicking, we should now work together, show resolve. And right now, the number one cause is to try to help Ukraine to come out of this horrible illegal war, which was started by Russia and nobody else.
Would Norwegian troops potentially be part of what Keir Starmer has called a coalition of the willing to guard any peace?
We are, of course, part of these conversations because we would be happy to contribute in one way or the other, but we have not made choices that I don't think many countries have actually about what exactly we would do in practice, because we need to know what is it that is there to be secured first. But that conversation is important. And as I said, Europe shall not only ask for a place at the table, but also suggest that we will be helpful and constructive in line with the needs of Ukraine, and in line with the needs for a secure and lasting and just peace. And we will be there.
Minister, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, Norway, that's massively increased its aid to Ukraine this week, and the EU's office also come up with a huge plan they're calling Rearm Europe. Penny, during your time in government, the Conservatives were very often very busy arguing amongst yourselves, and there was criticism also that there were too many links between the Conservative Party and Russia. Do you think you underestimated the risk from that country?
Well, as someone on Putin's hit list and been threatened by various agents of Russia, I'm very clear-eyed about this. Look, I think it's really obvious to us in Europe why Putin has to be stopped. It is worth saying why it's in America's interest too. As Dan will testify, Eisenhower, when he was president, rewrote the security rules for the United States to have regard to the things that made America great in the first place. And there's many nations around the world that tolerate and enjoy American economic and hard power primacy because of what they stood for. And I think if you're going to reduce things to just transactions between nations as opposed to focusing on these values, you are going to end up paying a heavier price for things.
But do you think the West underestimated Russia? I mean, for a long time in this country and in the States, people thought, oh, we can deal with Putin, actually.
I have always argued
yeah.
that we need to be doing more to bolster our defences, absolutely. I think that we're not quite awake enough yet. We're still holding back on defence spending. This is a real moment for Europe. It will be a hard price to pay, but if we don't do this now, the price we will pay in years to come will be unbearable.
Dan, do you think that the UK has somehow, a lot of Keir Starmer's backers would say actually under him, the UK's refound some of Britain's sort of traditional role to be the problem solver, to be the kind of convener? Do you see that?
I think what's going on is so fascinating at the moment because both in the US and the UK we are accessing a much more distant version of our history. Trump talking about Greenland, talking about Canada. Actually, that's quite common. In the 19th century, the Americans spent quite a lot of time trying to grab Greenland and Canada.
So Britain and America in history books.
Yeah. So, but whereas most people think history is the last 80 years and they maybe extend back to the Second World War, in fact, what Trump is, he's connecting with an isolationist version of American history, a version of American history that seeks to dominate particularly North America and Central America. Britain also can return to its traditional history, which is we sit round on the coast of Europe trying to checkmate powers that seek to dominate the continent. Philip of Spain, Kaiser Wilhelm, Napoleon, Hitler, and we do so by reaching out to allies and building coalitions. And often we used to get in trouble because they say Britain used to sort of pay and the Austrians would die. And so what we're doing now is exactly what William Pitt was doing in the early 19th century. Keir Starmer's trying to put together coalitions to restrain someone that would seek to dominate Europe. But the last thing I'd say, and Penny's point is so important, is all this nonsense about America's been paying for. If there's one nation on earth that has benefited from the late 20th century hyperpower of America, it is America themselves. I'm sitting here wearing American shoes, American underwear. You don't need to know that. I sold my company to an American buyer. We have got all of us looking at our American phones. I embarrassingly drove here today in a well-known electric car model that was American, which anyone wants to buy, this will be available soon on the second-hand market. But the point is, America's built the biggest economy in recorded history. They've benefited massively, and lastly, they've benefited because actually it turns out Americans not having Europe as a peer rival might be a good thing.
It's fascinating to hear you put all of that into the big sweep of history. But the reality, Luke, for this government, however well or not it might be doing diplomatically, is that what voters really thank their leaders for? Or actually, is it, can you get a GP's appointment? Is your kid at a decent school?
Well, look, as I said, there's no doubt that Keir Starmer seems to be benefiting in the polls from his handling of Ukraine. I think it perhaps gives him an opportunity to reset his relationship with the public because his approval ratings haven't been great to date. He didn't have a long honeymoon, if a honeymoon at all. So Ukraine provides the opportunity for him to do that. But ultimately, it is domestic issues that voters care about, and that is what will determine the course of his premiership.
Well, as Luke has explained, events do appear to be having something of an effect on the polls at home. Labour, as he's just been telling us, edging up a bit. The Tories also edging up a bit. And Nigel Farage's Reform UK party slipping back a touch. And in the last couple of days, they've managed to have a big row, even in its small group of 5 MPs. Rupert Lowe, one of its number, there he is, says it was still a protest party led by the Messiah, pointing to Nigel Farage. The party almost immediately then suspended him over allegations of bullying and threats of violence. Now, that MP, you might remember, was previously endorsed to be leader by Elon Musk. But he's denied those claims and he's been booted out of the party. Neither Mr Lowe nor Mr Farage agreed to talk to us today, but Richard Tice, the deputy leader, did a bit earlier.
Well, look, this is very sad, Laura, and we had been aware of Rupert's behaviour and we couldn't ignore these allegations, and quite rightly the chairman, Zia Youssef, said that we had to have an independent investigation led by a KC. That is underway. As I say, it's very sad, it's unfortunate, but we had to be decisive. It was the responsible thing to do. And imagine if we hadn't done that. Imagine if we'd tried in some way to brush it under the carpet. That would have been completely the wrong thing to do.
I'll ask you again, though, when did you first know? You say you'd known from some time, because the timing appears to many people, perhaps people watching this, it appears rather curious, because on Thursday, Mr Lowe was very critical of Nigel Farage, saying that Reform was still a protest party run by someone like the Messiah. And the very next day, miraculously, these allegations of bad behaviour, which Mr Lowe denies, were was suddenly out in the public domain and you called the cops?
Well, at the end of the day, the chairman, Zia Youssef, he had to make these difficult decisions, and I was aware of that on Friday, just before it was announced, because that's the right way to deal with these things. But in terms of the anxieties that we had over Rupert's behaviour, regrettably that had been going on for some time, just before the Christmas parliamentary break. As had previously been reported, there was a unfortunate, regrettable incident in the House of Commons itself. So there was an unfortunate trend here, and we had these bullying allegations, and they have to be dealt with. I understand there's a parliamentary investigation, and as a party, there's a duty of care to people who are either directly or indirectly employed, and it's quite proper and right that that's dealt with in the responsible way.
But was it responsible then to sit on these allegations that were made around incidents happening in December before Christmas, and then lo and behold?
Well, I don't know the specifics of exact timings. I wouldn't expect to. That wouldn't be appropriate either.
Well, forgive me, Nigel Farage forgive me, Mr. Tice. Nigel Farage has written in the Telegraph today about an incident in December.
Well, that's the Parliament. That's the incident in the House of Commons, which is different to the investigation, which is into the serious allegations by 2 female employees, and that has to be dealt with. Obviously, I wouldn't expect to hear when that allegation is submitted. It has to run its course, and the chairman has that responsibility of deciding what to investigate as a responsible employer, and he has our full support.
But Rupert Lowe has denied these allegations very firmly. He said it's false, the claims that are being made. And I think, do you expect viewers to believe there is no connection between the fact that Rupert Lowe was very rude about the party and Mr. Farage on Thursday, and news of these allegations emerged on Friday? Do you expect people to believe that?
I think people will believe that, because there is absolutely no truth in that suggestion. The reality is, the sad reality is, Rupert's been doing some great work, but there have been too many instances where actually we've seen a different character, and it's become just really challenging.
I'm sure many people watching this will be disappointed. You've been at the top of some recent opinion polls. You've obviously been growing as a party. You've got thousands and thousands of new members. But isn't the danger with all this that having this kind of spat in public, these allegations of behaviours of one of an MP, that you don't look like the professional party that you aspire to be, and that some people watching this might think you're more interested in fighting with each other, and you don't look like you could even run a normal HR process, and you might not look like you can even run a bath?
It's exactly the opposite. It's because we are professionalising, it's because we are responsible, that we've taken difficult decisions. The easy decision would have been to try and cover it up, to brush it under the carpet. We couldn't do that. The grief that we would have received, that we've said, no, you've got to deal with it, we've got to be united.
Just lastly, Rupert Lowe still wants to sort this out. He's issued a public invitation, which he says he's asked many times in private, to have dinner with Nigel Farage and sort all of this out. Would he take that up, or is he absolutely now out of the party?
The whip has been withdrawn. I don't know who's going to have what culinary delicacies with each other going forwards, but look, the whip has been withdrawn. We're a united team going forwards, and we are going to battle to save Britain.
Richard Tice, thanks so much indeed for your time this morning. Thank you. Well, Rupert Lowe sent us a statement this morning. He said, it's so disappointing to hear these falsehoods from a friend. If these allegations were so serious, why only remove me from the party the day after I raised reasonable concerns around Reform's leadership? Why kick me out of the party before any investigation has started? I am innocent, and Richard knows that, he says. Well, someone who won't be crying over this row in Reform is the Shadow Home Secretary here for the Conservatives, Chris Philp, this morning. What does it say that you're still regularly being beaten in the polls by Reform UK, who, as we've seen in the last few days, don't really appear to be a proper professional party yet?
Well, the polls are bouncing around a bit, and when it comes to real elections, council by-elections, we're doing very well. I think
polls are showing consistently that you are behind Nigel Farage's party.
I think Reform are doing a little worse now. The public realise that Nigel Farage is something of an admirer and supporter of Vladimir Putin, which no one is very happy about or impressed by, including Reform's own voters. And we've seen Rupert Lowe last week say out loud what we all know, that Reform is essentially a protest party, with no seriously thought out policies led by, as Rupert Lowe said, a messianic leader. And how did they respond to that? They responded by essentially smearing him straight afterwards.
Are you suggesting that Nigel Farage actually admires Vladimir Putin?
Well, he said that. He said he admires Vladimir Putin a few years ago. And last summer, Nigel Farage disgracefully said that NATO had provoked Russia's barbaric invasion, which is frankly a disgraceful thing to say. So when Rupert Lowe kind of raised concerns and sort of called out the fact that Reform are just a protest party with no real ideas, he then got smeared by his own side. They're divided and they've got no ideas.
But here's the question for you as a Conservative. If they are a protest party with no ideas, why are they beating you in the polls on a very regular basis?
Well, because it's easy to come up with simplistic slogans, which is what they've been doing. I think when real elections come around, people think about, does any political party have the credible, carefully thought through ideas? So Kemi and I in the immigration area are working on those, for example, which we may come on to. Reform don't have those serious ideas. And when they're put to the test in real council by-elections, there have been over 200 since the general elections. These are real by-elections. We have won 5 times more of those seats than Reform have.
OK. Let's then talk about your new plans, because you are proposing to make a big change today. To use the technical term, you're proposing to disapply the Human Rights Act when it comes to immigration. Essentially, that would be telling the courts they don't have to pay attention to the Human Rights Act when it comes to immigration cases. Do you really want to take people's rights away from them?
Well, we're not taking their rights away from them. And just to be clear about what this means, since the Human Rights Act was passed by Tony Blair in 1998, it means UK judges can apply their interpretation of the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, to domestic cases, including immigration. Now, the ECHR is very vaguely worded. It contains things like a right to a family life. Well, what does that mean? It means whatever a judge says it does. And what's happened in recent years is judges have expanded the definition of what that means in ways that defy common sense and in ways that stop us removing dangerous foreign criminals and others with no right to be here. So let me just give an example. There was a case of a Zimbabwean paedophile who had abused children here in the UK, and we couldn't send him back to Zimbabwe because he would, quote, face hostility there, which allegedly breaches his human rights. But what about the human rights of children here in the UK to be protected? There was another case of an Iraqi drug dealer who wasn't sent back to Iraq, as he should have been, because apparently he'd become, quotes, too westernised. These judgments are absurd. They're allowing dangerous criminals to stay in the UK, putting British citizens at risk, and it simply has to end, and that's why we've made this announcement.
But what you're really criticising, and you've shown it just there, is you're really criticising how judges are using the law. There are plenty of cases that might sound ridiculous to many people listening to you this morning. But isn't the point about human rights law is that it applies to everybody, to anybody who lives in this country can seek protection under human rights law. And you might not like it, but do you want to live in a country where politicians can pick and choose who gets their rights protected?
No, look, of course we believe in rights, but where you have courts just constantly expanding the definition in a way that was never contemplated at the beginning, when these rights were enshrined 70-odd, 80-odd years ago,
but again,
it gets out of hand.
But again, that's about how judges are applying the law. That's what you keep mentioning. Do you really want to be in a situation where politicians are sort of playing pick and mix with the legal system? Isn't the point that the judiciary is independent and people like you don't interfere in it?
The point is, I think it's for Parliament, the democratically elected Parliament, to set laws and for the courts then to interpret them. But because the ECHR is so vaguely worded, it means Parliament essentially can't legislate precisely to say what should and should not kind of count as a right and who should and should not be allowed to remain. Parliament has essentially been circumvented and trumped, as it were, by the way these ECHR rights are being interpreted. The courts are inventing novel and very expansive ways of interpreting these articles, which no one ever thought about.
Because you want to change the law and change the human rights law in this country because you're not happy with how judges have been using it. And this came up recently in Parliament. Both your leader, Kemi Badenoch, and the Prime Minister both made criticisms of one particular case. But I just want to read you and our viewers what the most senior judge in England and Wales said. Lady Chief Justice Baroness Sue Carr said the remarks were unacceptable and conflicted with the duty of politicians to uphold the rule of law and respect the independence of judges?
Well, I think she's wrong. I think it's reasonable for politicians, whether it's Keir Starmer, Kemi Badenoch or me, to comment on these judgments, particularly because these judges are inventing new interpretations. They're essentially inventing new law without reference to Parliament. That's what the ECHR has given them the power to do. And what we're saying is no, UK judges should follow UK law that's been passed by Parliament. They're still independent, they're still applying the law, but the law set by Parliament, not stretching the elastic. Now, it's important to say that in this proposal, we are still saying in the ECHR, so people can still appeal to Strasbourg, but many of these most ridiculous judgments that defy common sense come from the British courts.
But why not then go the whole hog and leave the whole thing? Lots of people in your party, your colleague, the Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, he thinks you should just leave the ECHR, leave the whole thing, make it clear. Yeah. Doesn't that make more sense?
Well, there are 2 points. Firstly, this proposal we're making will make a very big difference. It'll stop UK judges doing this, and we're going to put it to a vote in Parliament as an amendment to a bill. So we'll see whether Labour want to protect our borders. We'll see how Labour vote. Now, on your question, the wider question of ECHR membership as a whole. Now, that is a big question. It needs proper consideration. And in the coming months, we are going to be thinking about that properly. We're not going to rush into it and kind of shoot from the hip in an ill-considered way.
But that's still on the table.
We are going to be, yes, it is. And we are going to be considering that in a very carefully considered manner in the coming months.
In terms of this particular proposal, and how you've been very critical this morning of how judges have been applying the law. You raised eyebrows previously by some of the things you said about this. Do you stand by saying that judges have twisted the law in order to protect paedophiles instead of children? Well,
I've given you, yes I do, and I've given you an example of a case there, that a paedophile from, I think it was Zimbabwe, who was allowed to stay in the UK in contravention of our own law. So Section 32 of the Borders Act 2007 says that foreign national offenders should be removed.
But do you
he was allowed to, let me finish, Laura. He was allowed to stay because a judge found he would be faced with some hostility back in Zimbabwe in a way that breached his ECR right. Now, I don't agree with that judgment because I think it's more important to protect children in this country. That is my job as an elected parliamentarian. I'm not going to apologise for doing that.
But do you think that a judge in this country deliberately chose to put a paedophile's rights over the rights of British children? Do you think that was their calculation rather than just them trying to apply the law in a way that you didn't like and many people listening this morning might not like? But do you think they did that deliberately?
Well, I mean, it was a judgment that was handed down. And by the way, they weren't applying UK law. They were applying an interpretation of the ECHR. That is a very different thing. Now, I'm not sure what judges' motivations are. They're probably like erring on the side of generosity in each individual case. Let's sort of be generous and say that. But the cumulative effect of that, the practical effect of that, over hundreds and thousands of individual cases, is that foreign national offenders, foreign criminals who should be deported under the 2007 Borders Act, are not being deported. And I think it's one of my jobs as an elected parliamentarian to make sure that our domestic laws are respected, that dangerous foreign criminals are removed, and we can't allow these inventive and frankly common sense defying interpretations of the ECHR by domestic judges to stop that. And that's why we're tabling this amendment. We've thought about it very carefully, we've analysed it very carefully. It will make a real difference, and that's why we're going to table it in Parliament tomorrow, Monday, and we're going to force it to a vote in the Bill Committee and then on the floor of the House.
Well, it will be interesting to see what happens. Just briefly, you've been quite honest before about mistakes that the Conservatives made in government. Was it a mistake to allow the civil service to get so big? And ironically, some viewers might think it's going to be a Labour government that's going to try and cut it back.
Yes, it was. The civil service did get too big and it consumes far too much money. It's grown by about 25% in the last few years. But, I mean, Labour's plans, when they admitted to the, I think off the record, they've admitted to the number, Labour's plans are a 2% reduction. Now,
we were the ones allowed to get so big.
We went, and that was wrong, and we went into the election with a process that was underway that would have reduced it by 12%. That wasn't just a plan, that was being implemented when the last election happened. Now, I think that 12% reduction made a lot of sense, and Labour's sort of off-the-record secret 2% plan is pretty, frankly, weak and anemic by comparison.
All right, well, we'll see what happens with that this week. Chris Philp, always good to have you with us, Shadow Home Secretary. Thank you very much indeed. Well, as we've been talking to the politicians, you've been busy getting in touch too. Chris Clarkson has responded to our main story this morning on Ukraine. He says our silence and kowtowing to the US is doing nothing for us but hurting Ukraine. Trump is stitching them up. Sean Boker looks ahead to some of the welfare changes this week. Benefit reform needs to pay to go to work. In our household, we would be £200 £200 a month better off if I gave up work. And Jules Heff responds to some of Mr McFadden's government reform plans. AI in the civil service, thank goodness for that. HMRC might eventually get my tax code right. Do keep getting in touch because we love to hear what you have to say. And let's have a final moment with our panel here this morning. What do you make of this Conservative plan on human rights, Dan?
Well, it's a bit striking, isn't it, that this week of all weeks, when the rest of us are struggling to understand what's happening to our world, to reach out to try and protect those bits of the rules-based international order that has delivered such extraordinary wealth, prosperity, safety to so many people in this country and beyond, it's just striking that they've come out with their exciting new flagship policy, and that is taking a pickaxe to sort of an element of that. And no doubt it's good politics. I kind of hope it isn't in a way, but it feels disappointing in its timing.
Penny, would you have done that? I mean, you fancied Kemi Badenoch's job. You'd had a run at the leadership too. Do you think that they're onto something here?
So look, I think one of the wonderful things about our country is, compared to what's happening in the United States, is we do have checks and balances. Our constitution isn't written down all in one place, but we have this fine balance, and that gives us huge flexibility. When I was at Defence and I was struggling to keep certain international laws as prime, things like the Geneva Convention, the Human Rights Act actually caused me a lot of problems to do that. So I think it's right that we look at that we look at the practices of the ECHR, and we also look at how the Supreme Court is evolving. It's creeped to become a constitutional court.
But is it right to say this whole area of policy, immigration cases, because some of them do, to many people listening this morning would have thought, well, those cases do sound ridiculous. Is it right to say in this area of policy, we're not going to have that law apply anymore?
No, we've got to have these debates. That's the nature of how we run things in this country. But the fourth thing that we have to do is also look at the global rules on refugees. These were written at a time when no one had a mobile phone and we were facing very different types of situations, none of the organised crime gangs that you see now. So we've got to do that as well. So the international rules-based order is important, but unless it reforms, we're going to have problems. You must enable countries to protect their borders. If you do so, they can use the finite resource they have to help people.
And Luke, what do you make of the Tories' positioning now? Do you think that this is the kind of thing that's going to help them get some momentum and some kind of cut through?
Well, it's interesting, when you chat to people about the Tory party now and ask what they think of the Tories, a word which comes up all the time in focus groups is lost, that they don't really know what the Conservatives are about anymore. And part of that is they've got this challenge on the right from Reform UK. Now, this week, it's looked like they might have some openings on Reform UK. You know, Farage is on the wrong side of public opinion on Ukraine. The fallout with Rupert Lowe means they're sort of failing that credibility test. And so it offers the Conservatives a chance to redefine themselves. But of course, they've got that legacy of the 14 years in office, and people will say to them, well, you know, you had 14 years to change all of this, you didn't do it then, and numbers went up. And yes, these cases that Chris was talking about do drive people mad. They think they're so unfair that these people are allowed to stay and can't be deported. But people say, why didn't you do it?
And Dan, where do you think, from a historical point of view, the swing of the pendulum is right now in UK politics?
The swing of the pendulum in UK politics, goodness me, well, the swing of the pendulum is that for the first time in a long time, there's a challenge, you know, the challenge to the right of the Conservative Party. And for years, Tory electoral success has been driven by the fact that it's traditionally been the left that's been split. And so we are in this, and now we're in this extraordinary world, which is great fun for psephologists, where you are going to, the first past the post system is going to start spitting out some absolutely astonishing results.
Well, all of that will be fascinating to watch. It's been fascinating to listen to you three and our other guests this morning. Thank you so much to our trio at the desk and to all of our guests. And of course, thank you most of all to you for spending your Sunday with us when we've been trying to ponder whether the turmoil around the world has given the government here a bit more of a sense of purpose. You'll hear a lot from ministers in the next couple of days on that, building to a big speech with a big argument from the Prime Minister later in the week. There is always opportunity in a crisis. That is the reality of politics. But the glamour of international diplomacy doesn't take away the need for hard graft at home. I'll be with Paddy O'Connell a bit later on BBC Sounds on this Sunday's newscast. And of course, I will look forward very much to seeing you next Sunday, same time, same place.